Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking on something seriously fascinating, a dense, highly provocative, and honestly, game-changing paper by the philosopher Abu Yareb al-Marzuki. The core of his work is this rigorous, absolute takedown of modern Islamology, which is the academic study of Islam. Al-Marzuki basically argues that the way modern intellectuals look at the Quran completely misunderstands what the text actually is. Instead of just seeing it as a product of its time, he proposes we look at it as a meta-ethical system. So, if you're the kind of person who loves structured arguments and massive academic paradigm shifts, well, this analysis is absolutely going to challenge how you look at historical texts forever.
Now, to really grasp the intellectual stakes of this text, we've got to start with al-Marzuki's opening thesis. And let me tell you, he doesn't pull any punches here. He provocatively argues that much of what we consider modern, objective Islamology is actually disguised Islamophobia. He claims that certain intellectual elites present what they call a scientific reading of religious history, but they do it without true foundational knowledge. It's a huge, bold challenge to the academic status quo, and it instantly sets the stage for a deep, deep methodological takedown.
So here's our cognitive roadmap for today. We're going to break this down into 6 logical steps. First, the philosophical dilemma. Second, critiquing modern Islamology. Third, the distortion of religion. Fourth, hypothesis 1, the patchwork text. Fifth, hypothesis 2, the unique system. And finally, number 6, decoding the text.
All right, starting right off with section 1, the philosophical dilemma.
So, al-Marzuki kicks things off with a pretty fundamental premise. Treating religion philosophically? It's notoriously tricky for everyone, believers and atheists alike. And the reason it's so difficult is that it almost inevitably mixes disciplines. You're blending theology, sociology, history, and epistemology all into one giant puzzle. Because of that blending, it becomes a highly, highly contested space. Al-Marzuki readily admits his own work might get attacked by the very Arab intellectual circles he's analyzing, mainly because they might accuse him of going against their so-called modern methods. But he argues that those modern methods are exactly what we need to put under the philosophical microscope. Let's move to section 2 and see how this builds, critiquing modern Islamology. To really get his critique, we have to look at his main target, the academic field of modern Islamology itself. Al-Marzuki points out that this modern approach is heavily influenced by Hegelian and Marxist traditions. And in those traditions, religion is often reduced to a placebo, right? It's viewed as just an ideological painkiller. Modern intellectuals tend to treat religion merely as a tool cooked up by clerics to pacify the masses, distract them from their misery, and suppress any potential for, say, class struggle or revolution. Al-Marzuki argues that by walking into the study of the Quran with this placebo assumption already locked in your head, these scholars are fundamentally crippling their own analysis before it even begins.
He actually breaks down the failure of these modern critiques into 2 massive blind spots, ideological and epistemological. The first one is ideological. This involves bringing flawed existential choices and deep-seated biases against religion into the academic study. So, essentially, deciding what religion is before you've actually studied it. The second obstacle is epistemological. This is the false and frankly arrogant assumption that the human mind has the absolute capacity to perfectly encompass, measure, and judge all of reality. Al-Marzuki simply points out that claiming absolute knowledge of reality just to judge a religious text is mathematically and philosophically impossible.
And that brings us to section 3, the distortion of religion.
Now, al-Marzuki isn't wearing rose-colored glasses here. He totally admits that religious institutions historically have been distorted. Yes, they absolutely have been corrupted and used for political gain or tyranny. However, he argues that judging the essence of a religion by its corrupted institutions is a massive logical fallacy. And this brilliantly illustrates his point. He says it's exactly like judging the concept of human rights based solely on how global superpowers abuse those rights as political pressure tools. Just because a superpower weaponizes human rights doesn't make human rights inherently bad. In the exact same way, just because clerics have weaponized religion doesn't mean the religious text itself is just a cheap ideological trick.
Moving right along to section 4, hypothesis 1, the patchwork text.
So having cleared away those academic blind spots, al-Marzuki sets up 2 totally conflicting interpretations of the Quranic text. The dominant view in modern Islamology treats the Quran as what they call a rhapsody. Now, in academic terms, a rhapsody isn't just a piece of music, it implies a concoction, a patchwork text that has just been stitched together from surrounding cultural context, local folklore, and earlier sources. This view effectively reduces the text to a mere sociocultural byproduct, totally stripping it of any overarching independent structure.
To boil this first hypothesis down, scholars in his camp basically argue three main things. First, the text is entirely dictated by its historical and social context. Second, because it shares stories with earlier traditions, they claim it relies heavily on plagiarism, or what they politely call intertextuality. And third, it just borrows its core concepts from prior religious texts. Now, Al-Marzouki is incredibly critical of this. He describes this approach as simplistic, reductionist, and honestly, just a silly way to read such a highly complex text.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 5, Hypothesis 2, the unique system.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is it reveals Al-Marzouki's ultimate paradigm shift. Instead of the typical Islamologist view of this concocted patchwork driven entirely by social context, Al-Marzouki presents Hypothesis 2. The Quran is actually a unique, meta-ethical system. It isn't merely a product of its environment. Actually, it's an active diagnosis of universal spiritual obstacles. It looks at the human condition from a high-level, systemic view to identify exactly what is preventing humanity from achieving real spiritual and moral progress.
This is the crucial point right here. How does Al-Marzouki handle the whole accusation of plagiarism? Because modern critics will point to the Quran mentioning older religious narratives and yell, "Aha! Plagiarism!" But Al-Marzouki argues this completely misses the structural purpose of the text. The Quran does not plagiarize, it cites. It deliberately references prior religious traditions as case studies. It brings them up specifically to critique their historical distortions, especially those corrupt alliances formed between spiritual authority and temporal political power. It cites them to diagnose where past systems failed so it can present a reformative remedy. Calling this plagiarism? Well, he says that's like accusing a medical textbook of plagiarizing the diseases it's actually trying to cure.
All right, finally, let's look at Section 6, Decoding the Text.
To completely dismantle that old academic paradigm, Al-Marzouki challenges future scholars with a roadmap of 4 foundational questions you should ask whenever you encounter a critique of the Quran. Step 1. Is the patchwork hypothesis truly modern, or is it just recycled medieval theological disputes dressed up in modern secular language? Step 2. What is the hidden ideological premise of the critic? Step 3. What's their epistemological premise? Do they falsely assume they possess absolute knowledge? And Step 4. To what dimension of the text does their critique actually apply? By forcing scholars to answer these 4 questions, Al-Marzouki totally exposes the fragility of the dominant Islamologist approach. So what does this all mean? It brings us right to the ultimate question Al-Marzouki leaves us to ponder. Is the Quran truly a unique systemic work? If we strip away the biased assumptions, drop the Marxist frameworks, and look past the lazy accusations of plagiarism, do we actually find a unified meta-ethical system designed to diagnose and cure the human condition? It is a massive paradigm shift, and it completely challenges everything we think we know about the academic study of religion. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.